Have you ever been told by your doctor that you need to eat whole grains, avoid saturated fats, and run almost every day to improve your health? Well, this happens to hundreds of thousands of people in the US alone on a regular basis. And yet, the number one cause of heart attacks and strokes, insulin resistance, gets ignored, neglected, and continues to grow right in front of us. Actually, this exact situation happened to our guest today. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Ken Berry. He's a doctor who's become a big YouTube personality, and he's helping a lot of people. His own personal story, which he shared with us, is paints a really bad picture of the current state of preventive medicine in the United States. And let me tell you, it just ain't good. It is ugly. Now, this interview will help you identify how to decrease your own cardiovascular risk. Dr. Berry shares what he did to go from obese with prediabetes to healthy. And it was not following nutritional guidelines. He was not set up on the food pyramid. After the interview, we'll allocate some time, as usual, to answer your questions. And yes, Jesus will be watching to see if I answer any questions, even if you're a non-member. But we'll see if I can get away with it. So let's go to the interview without further ado. Today we have Dr. Ken Berry. Ken, thank you so much for joining us. I've seen a lot of your stuff from our discussions earlier. It's clear you've seen a little bit of my stuff, and I appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. And yeah, it's true. I've been watching your videos for a few years and kind of watching you evolve into this very helpful YouTube doctor. And, some people use that term denigratingly, but I feel like, a doctor's ultimate job is to help as many people as possible get as healthy as possible. And currently, you can't do that, seeing 20, 30, 40 people a day in a clinic. If you really want to help a lot of people improve their health, you have to be on social media.
You really do. I used to run several medical systems. I remember running the program for MD Live and for the company that's now known as Premise. In each of those, I had up to 700 doctors that I was supervising. And at the end of the day, you start looking at the eyeball time that I get on YouTube, it dwarfs what I was getting or what our 700 doctors were getting on a daily basis. Yep. The other thing is the quality of the information. You can't rely on another doc to give good information in terms of prevention.
True.
So for you and for the folks watching, there are several topics I wanted to cover. I'm most interested in your life. I've read both editions of your book, and as we said earlier, I have some questions about just how much editing you did between the two. The first and second. It looked to me like there was a lot of edits and you did a whole lot of work. I didn't go back though. I didn't take the time to go back and do a line by line comparison. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. Get a little bit into diet debates. I think you're more of for the most part, you're a carnivore. For the most part, I'm an omnivore. But I think one of the key things that I want to focus on is getting away from the tribalism. I've got both ends of the spectrum in my practice. Got carnivores and vegans, and sometimes I think they just get way too emotional about what they're dealing with. Wanted to talk a little bit about insulin resistance and testing for insulin resistance. Some of the stuff that you've covered in terms of advice for doctors, and those are my goals. Do you have any others for today?
Just wherever the conversation leads, I think we're both capable of hanging on.
Sounds good. So one of the things that you started right off the bat was looking at, you mentioned I used to be an ER doc, and you said you did too. Tell us a little bit about that transition from ER to where you are now.
So I initially, during my medical school training, I had no intentions of ever having a clinic. Clinic days, when we would go work in a clinic with a doctor, those were my least favorite. My favorite days were when I was in the OR or the ER. And I had full intentions of being a general surgeon until I came face to face with the reality that all general surgeons start their day at 4 a.m. And when I was in medical school, I was definitely a night owl. I was not an early bird at all. And that's actually kind of changed over the years. But I just couldn't do that. And I thought, well, maybe OBGYN, they do a ton of procedures, right? Until I realized that all pregnant women go into labor at 3:30 a.m. And it's like, well, that's not going to work. Okay. So finally, then at the university I trained at, family medicine is very aggressive. Some family medicine residencies, it's literally sinus infections and hypertension and diabetes. That's it. But in Tennessee, at the University of Tennessee in Memphis, they had they called it advanced family medicine, and we delivered babies. We did tons of procedures, lots of scopes, lots of dermatological procedures. And I was like, hey, this is fun. I actually like this. I could, then sculpt my practice. And so for the first 7 years after I got my license, I was an ER doc, and I thought that would be my career, because although there are times of boredom and downtime, you never know when somebody's going to come in with something that's been severed, or something that's squirting arterial blood, or that has a flail chest from multiple rib fractures, that you're about to have to save this person's life. And that's why I went into medicine, was to save people's lives, not to refill prescriptions. And so I loved that. And then someone taught me, and every patient that came to the little ER I worked at said, I like you, doc. You ought to start a clinic. And as well as I do as a physician, oftentimes this is people blowing smoke. But after I'd heard that 2 or 3 times, I thought, well, I don't know. I could have a little clinic, do 2 or 3 days a week. Well, the demand was much greater than that. And I wound up being full-time in the clinic 5 days a week. Plus working full-time in the ER for several years. And I saw the dichotomy between being in the ER and acutely saving someone's life, but also not addressing the root causes of why they wound up in my ER with heart failure, heart attack, advanced COPD, with respiratory failure, that, renal failure. Why? And it never occurred to me to kind of say, why is this happening? But then when I got in the clinic, all of a sudden, seeing these people every 3 months, I started to ask, well, what's causing this? And then when you add to the fact that I started out as this very lean and healthy young doctor practicing, and after a few years, I was severely obese by the clinical definition, and pre-diabetic, and had a long list of other maladies that made my life continual suffering. That's really, I have to be honest, that my selfish desire to reclaim my health was my initial epiphany that something's going on here. Something's not right. I don't understand why everybody's sick, including me, who's never been sick at all. And so kind of on that platform is what I started to build my current beliefs about medicine, nutrition, health, and health improvement.
We got some parallels. When I started med school, I thought neurosurgery or heart surgery, that, you'd save lives. And then it became really clear really quickly that by the time somebody gets on a surgical table, it's way too late.
Yes.
And so the same thing happened to me in ER. So I remember as I was going through, I trained at MUSC in Charleston, and then did a rotating internship at Charity, because once I began to get into med school and realize this, I was a little bit lost. I had not seen prevention, and I felt like doctors, no matter which way you turned, were just shoveling against a tide that they were never going to impact. And if we were actually focused on health, we wouldn't be practicing medicine. We wouldn't be prescribing stuff. We wouldn't be doing all that. We would be spending time teaching, and people just didn't seem to be that interested in education. doctors doing education. I remember a couple of my role models, a couple of my teachers had this emotional meeting. They didn't tell me what the agenda was. They brought me in and they said, "You're wasting your career. You're good. You could do some stuff." And I said, "Yeah, and I'm going to go into ER because I can't figure out what I want to do because I'm not going to do any of that stuff." It was just once I got into the ER, seeing how many 50-year-olds, yet another one having a heart attack, it was like an epiphany. I've got to go. I found emergency medicine, same thing, a placeholder. And then I said, let me go to prevention. I went to Johns Hopkins. I was extremely happy with my choice. At the time I went, it mostly was public health. So I got focused on that for a while, but I'm very, very happy with where I've ended up. Like I said, I'm curious. Well, pardon me, we're going to have problems with that. I keep forgetting about that stuff. It's hooked into our system and sometimes it gets stuck. If it does, we'll figure out what to do about it. But back to you. So tell me a little bit more. I know I read in both, I think it was both editions of the book, a very, very telling and winning. One of the things, you went up several notches in my mind when you said I was obese, I was arrogant, I was telling my patients to lose weight, and tell me a little bit more about that space. What was the epiphany moment for you?
So it's still embarrassing to talk about it, and also it brings up quite a bit of shame in my heart. And so, as well as I do, that doctors believe that their patients are not following our recommendations. This belief in doctors is ubiquitous. We tell people, look, you need to move more and eat less. And, you got to lose some weight. You're just getting out of hand. Your diabetes is terrible. Your A1C is 12. You got to get off the couch. You got to move more and eat less. And that was my standard advice for somebody who was obese and pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic was you got to join the gym and join Weight Watchers. And then they would come back in 3 or 6 months and their diabetes was worse and they'd gain 10 pounds. And I absolutely admit that I thought they were full of crap. They were, and they would say, "No, doc, I'm doing this and that." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, whatever. I know you're not doing any of that, right?" That's the arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
Is just suspecting the worst in my patients. But then, Dr. Ford, I became obese. And like I said earlier, I was working in the ER full time and in the clinic full time. So I lived in scrubs. And you probably remember, scrubs have a big long drawstring at the waist, right? And so that same pair of scrubs will fit you even after you've gained 50 pounds. There won't be as much strength left after you tie it, but they still fit fine. And so that was a bit deceptive. I knew I'd gained weight, but I had no idea how much. And one day I jumped on the scale and I'm 6'3.5", and I weighed 297 pounds.
Wow. So what kind of BMI is that?
Oh, it's 30. I think it was 35, 36, something like that. I mean, it qualified for severe obesity. We used to call it morbid obesity, right? But we've changed the language a little bit so it's a little less judgmental sounding. And I'm like, oh, crap, that's bad. So then I went the next clinic day. I sat down and I told my lab tech, I said, draw the labs. I got to know where I'm at here. And my A1C was 5.9. And I'm like, okay,
pre-diabetic. A lot worse.
Exactly. I'm one of those, my DNA, I fatten very easily. And I would have eventually definitely developed type 2 diabetes, but I wasn't there yet. And so I thought, okay, I can't have this because, as you may have detected, some people accuse me of having an accent. I'm a common sense country boy. And so it makes no sense. It's very incongruous for me to be a fat diabetic doctor who proceeds to talk to 30 or 40 people a day saying you got to lose weight, you got to do better on your diet. I couldn't live my life being that doctor. So I had to fix this. So immediately I took home a copy of the PDF handout from the American Diabetes Association that I gave to all my obese diabetic patients. And I started following it. And so for the next 3 months, I jogged 3 days a week, which I freaking hate to jog. And I drank fruit juice smoothies, and I ate whole grain bread, and I stopped eating all the bacon and saturated fat, and ate all the fruits and veg, right? And so many servings of whole grain bread with margarine, because, you know, butter is saturated fat. And then I got my labs rechecked in 3 months and jumped on the scale again, and I'd actually gained a little bit of weight, and my A1C had went up to 6.1. And that was, and so now you see what I'm faced with.
Yeah.
I live with me, Dr. Ford. I knew what I was doing. I could not accuse me of laying on the sofa eating jelly donuts, because I knew for the last 3 months I'd been out on the road jogging 3 days a week, 2 to 3 miles every time, and just living on fruits and vegetables and whole grain bread. And it made me worse, not better. And that was my epiphany. Not only that, hey, this advice is obviously not helpful, but then I was faced with the reality, the egregiousness of what my feelings to all my patients who were obese and type 2 diabetic. Maybe they had been following my advice all along. Maybe the ignorance in this equation was not their lack of listening, but my bad advice.
Let me interrupt and repeat. You followed your own advice. You got it from the ADA, and it made you worse, not better.
It did not.
I just wanted to repeat that. Go ahead.
It did not help at all. And you understand, for somebody, and I was that arrogant know-it-all. I read all. I had a subscription to the New England Journal. I routinely looked at all the newest stuff. I knew every new drug that came on the market. Some of my best friends were the drug reps that would come to tell me about the new drugs. I wholeheartly believed that pharmaceuticals were the solution, and that the latest research, both in nutrition and medicine, that the answer would be found there. And I was completely disappointed, not only in my own personal health, but in everybody else's as well. Because I didn't want to take pharmaceuticals. I didn't want to be on 3 or 4 or 5 different prescriptions. And also didn't want that for my patients unless it was absolutely necessary. And so it was at that moment that I was like, crap, I've got to go back to the drawing board here, because a lot of assumptions that I'd made that I took as self-evident were obviously incorrect. And so I had to go back and do a complete reassessment of the entire situation, including how I practice medicine, how I practice self-care, how I conducted myself in the doctor-patient interview. I had to come face to face with the fact that, dude, you thought you were the daddy doctor, and you don't know anything. You can't even fix your own self. And I think that kind of echoes itself in my book, Lies My Doctor Told Me.
Yeah.
I believe those lies. That's why I was repeating them. I thought they were the gospel. Turns out not so much.
So I apologize, everybody. I know that we're very deep into the video and the experience from Dr. Berry. But, I have to do this. We have a word from a sponsor for today, which is us. Join us on Dallas, Texas, April the 18th to the 20th. We have a very immersive summit on prevention health. If you want to know more about what to do to decrease your cardiovascular risk and go to the next level over not just the YouTube channel, which of course will give you plenty of information, but if you want to go even deeper into it, Dr. Brew has agreed to extend the early bird rate as requested by many people who are interested on the conference to April the 1st. And we have like less than 10 spots already available. This is almost completely sold out. So don't miss out. Dr. Brewer, do you have a quick question, quick comment for that? And we can go back to the video. Oh, you're on mute.
I don't know. How about now? Am I still on mute?
No. You're good.
So before we go back to hear the author of Lies My Doctor Told Me, who was also a doctor and has admitted, you know what? things are messed up in medicine. We got to fix it. Great interview. I enjoyed the heck out of it and look forward to the rest of that and then the questions that come out of it. But as you said, we've got an event coming up in Dallas, and the impact on the early bird is if you get in there early, what you're able to do is get your labs. This is not a conference where you sit around on your backside and listen to people talk all day. There will be some of that, but this is really more like a pop-up clinic. You actually, when you sign up for the event, you can get your labs. You can get them locally. We will go ahead and send lab orders to a lab near you. No matter where you are in the country. We've met a few people like in Montana where they had to travel half an hour, a little bit more to get to the labs. But if you live in Montana in the country, you sort of bought that when you moved there or when you lived there. But not only do you get those labs, you bring those results to the event. And if you want to share them with others, you can. You don't have to. But what happens is we go through each of the components of the labs. And even more so, we have a CIMT there. One of the more frustrating components for people is when we're evaluating our own risk for heart attack and stroke, what you do in standardized medicine is they look at risk factors. They don't really look at your metabolism. They don't look at labs so much. They don't look to understand what's going on metabolically with you. And most of all, they tend to, the standard of medicine today is to ignore metabolic health completely. And it's because it's not easy to do that. We go through all the details. That's what this event is about. Basically coming down, getting a complete metabolic evaluation, understanding clearly what your risk is, and then walking away with a very detailed plan, knowing what's happening inside your body, inside your metabolism for the next steps. So thanks, Jesus.
Wonderful. And if you want to go to the event and get to meet Dr. Brewer and myself and the other people on the PrevMed team, just call 859-721-1414 or visit PrevMedHealthEvents.com. All right, so let's go back to the video.
Oh, speaking of your book, I think you did mention reading, what's it called? Ivor Cummins' book, Eat Rich, Live Lean.
Yeah, Eat Rich, Live Long.
Live Long. So was that about the time when you picked up that book, or where right now you've just, at this point in time, you've followed your own advice from the ADA and you've gotten worse, not better. You've realized that's not working. My patients weren't lying to me. Now what do you do? What happened?
I had to look outside the box because daily I was doing CME from basically funded by the pharmaceutical companies. I had so many hours of CME. It's ridiculous. I used to have big 6-inch binders I would just put out in the waiting room for people to look at of all the different CMEs that I had taken. And people were very impressed by that. And I thought rightfully so back then. Now I realize that's not really something you should be impressed by. It's the first 3 books that I read that actually pointed in the right direction, because I was reading multiple journals, multiple books every week. It's foolish how much reading I was doing. It's not foolish, but you know what I'm saying. Anybody who looked at that be like, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he reading so much? The first 3 books that pointed me in what I now consider to be roughly the correct direction were The Primal Blueprint by Mark Sisson, The Paleo Diet by Lauren Cordain, and a 25-cent rummage sale, Dr. Atkins, the Atkins Diet Revolution. Yeah. And I still got that book with the 25-cent sticker on it. And I consider that one of the most valuable books in my collection, because based on those 3 books, I'm like, well, man, if these guys are right, then everything we tell patients about nutrition is wrong. And so I started to just roughly amateurishly apply some of the principles that they talk about in those 3 books. And lo and behold, I started to lose weight. In 3 months, my A1C had come down significantly, almost back to normal. It's back down to 5.7 now. And I'm like, okay, I don't believe I'm a special snowflake. I believe we all have 99.996% the same DNA. And I started to look into epigenetics. I started to look into the microbiome, all this stuff, and just started to engulf every book I could find about human nutrition, both from mainstream sources and from this weird clique of doctors and other writers like Cordain and Sisson and Atkins. Started buying books off eBay, books from the 1970s, 1960s, and before about diet and nutrition advice. And the more I kept looking at this, the more it kept making me look outside of nutrition research, look outside of medical research, and start to look in the past. And what ultimately happened was I wound up being an armchair anthropologist and an armchair archaeologist and paleoanthropologist. And I have no credentials in those fields whatsoever, but became a huge fan and research bug looking into these. And so that's when it kind of dawned on me, man, when you start looking at the archaeological and anthropological research, it's quite evident and has been known for decades what the human diet was and what the human diet should be. And that's kind of the foundation of everything I talk about now when it comes to nutrition advice is, what did we do in the past? And some people will say, well, that's an appeal to nature. That's a logical fallacy. Well, no. Before I was a doctor, my undergraduate degree is in animal biology, right? And there's a concept in biology called the adaptation hypothesis, that whatever you see a species doing, that it's been doing for a long damn time, that's probably matters. That's probably important. And that probably gives you some insight into what they should continue doing. So we can take, for example, cows eating grass. Cows have eaten grass for millions of years, right? They are completely and utterly adapted because of that million years of behavior, scores of millions of years of eating grass. So now, what if the American Bovine Diabetes Association came out and said, oh, grass is dangerous, you should eat meat? The latest research shows you should be eating more meat and less grass. What are all the cows to make of that? And that's a funny analogy, but I think it's perfectly applicable to what we've done to humans, because in the last few decades, we've had this amazing industrial revolution. Everything needs to be modern. Everything needs to be the latest and greatest, right? From your washing machine to the shoes you wear, to the watch you wear, to the food you eat. It needs to be modern, and you can go back and look at the old Crisco ads and how they just denigrated, oh, your grandmother cooks with lard. You don't want to do that. You want the latest modern, the newest stove and the newest shortening. And we fell for that because I'm a huge fan of technology. Huge fan, right? Look how we're conversing right now. But when it comes to the care and the feeding of the human animal, when it comes to what you feed this Homo sapiens sapien, modern is not the solution. That's not the solution. You have to use the adaptation principle and say, what were humans eating 3.5 million years ago, even before we were Homo sapiens sapien? What were we eating 1 million years ago, 100,000 years ago? And people will say, well, you can't know that. Oh, yeah, you can. There's a test in anthropology called stable isotope analysis. We can actually know very definitively what people were eating millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's known, and it's in the literature, and it's not debatable. No anthropologist says, no, we've been vegans for no, because you'd be laughed out of the discipline. It's known that we were, you can call us super carnivores, hyper carnivores, facultative carnivores, meaning that, yeah, we can eat plants, but every time we had a choice, we went for the fatty meat. Every time we had a choice, we ate animals, not plants. Only when we were starving did the majority of our diet consist of plants? That was the fallback food. And indeed, many anthropologists talk about plant foods as fallback foods. Some call them prisoner foods or slave foods, scarcity foods. When you couldn't get the big fatty animal, you would eat the plants. And we've adapted. We can do that. But so then you start saying, well, what's the optimal diet for humans versus what's a diet that you can get by on? And that, so all that's kind of where I've my journey from a guy who's like, well, I'm following the American Diabetes Association diet, and it made my diabetes worse, to what I recommend now. That's kind of how I got here.
That's a very interesting. You got there faster than I had planned to, but as I'm listening to you, I have a different perspective. I'm looking mostly at what's right in front of me, and I have an ocean of people who have undiagnosed prediabetes, diabetes, burning their arteries up. So, and I also have a whole bunch of them that feel very strongly that, oh no, ethically you got to eat plants only. I have a whole bunch of other folks who feel very angry at those guys and say, no, eat animals only. But I'm listening to you, and it reminds me of maybe the only paleoanthropology book that I've ever read. It was Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. And it's so long ago, I'm probably butchering it. But here's what I remember. I remember him talking about where they would find evidence that these certain tribes would discover grasses and discover the ability to take grains from the grasses. All of a sudden, their caloric access would explode. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, with their caloric access exploding, they could now feed an army.
Yep.
And
then
you
could also store that grain and hoard the grain. Whereas animals out in the wild, you can't really hoard that. Right. And so, yeah, Diamond's book is a great place for people to jump into this. Because he talks about basically the agricultural revolution of grains and seeds made tyranny possible. It made wars possible. It made the practice of slavery possible because you, as the ruler, you could accumulate and hoard all the food. And so, and I think in that book is where he called the agricultural revolution the worst thing to happen to humanity with regards to health and nutrition. And I think he's spot on with that assumption.
Well, if you look at today's world, and again, what I deal with as a doc, to me, the biggest challenge is processed grains, and and the many stealth maneuvers that it uses, like whole grains, whole wheat bread.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think it has been not a fool's choice, I think that's the wrong word, but it's like everything else in life. Every new solution creates a whole new set of problems. That may have been a solution for tribes to gain power, mm-hmm. and it may have been a solution for caloric access, but it brings it brings the number one causes of death and disability in our modern world. And it's stuff we got to deal with.
Yep. And then when we look at an example like Egypt, ancient Egypt, the Egyptian climate is unique in that when you die there, you almost auto mummify, right? And then also we know that the Egyptians practiced several levels of mummification, and a lot of people think only the King Tut and the other rulers were mummified, but the truth of the matter is that in ancient Egyptian society, unless you were a pauper or a prisoner, you got some level of mummification. And so there are researchers who have done CAT scans on thousands of mummies from all strata of Egyptian society, from the highest to the lowest. They were riddled with heart disease. Plaques from stem to stern everywhere, severe plaquing, and also terrible dental cavities, dental abscess, terrible tooth decay. But the coronary arteries and the arterial circulation is where I focus. They were riddled with it. Well, what diet were they eating? They were eating a grain-based, plant-based diet with almost no red meat at all. They used the cows to pull heavy objects. They didn't eat them. They ate a little bit of fish, a little bit of poultry. Mainly, they were actually known as the bread people by other cultures at that time. They are riddled with heart disease. And now also keep in mind, they were not eating our modern GMO wheat. They were eating Emmer wheat, the ancient organic non-GMO grains. That was non-modified diet, and they were riddled with heart disease. And so, you look at the CAT scans from back then, and now that the American Heart Association is literally recommending the diet that gave them severe coronary artery disease. And that, again, another example of what? Wait a minute, what? We've got documented evidence. And so this is why I recommend in the book that doctors read so widely, is because you can't just read medical literature and be a really good doctor unless you're in some subspecialty where, if you're an ophthalmologist, you need to just engulf the research in your specialty, because that's what's going to make you a good ophthalmologist. But if you're primary care, if you're talking about diet with your patients and you're just reading the American Journal of Nutrition and the medical literature, you're going to give terrible dietary advice almost by definition.
So while you're mentioning your book, and your advice to docs, I got to make this comment. I don't know if you know it, but I think it may have been one of your first advice points to doctors, and that is listen to your patient. They'll tell you their diagnosis.
Yep.
Does that ring any bells? Have you heard that somewhere else before?
I was told that by one of my most honored preceptors, Dr. Lauren Crown, who his two pieces of advice to me were, number one, stop complaining. You can sleep when you die. That was the first thing.
Advice.
It's terrible advice, but for a young doctor, I was like, okay, noted. I'll do that. And so I slept every third day. But then also he would say, if you will just shut up and sit still and let your patient talk, they will tell you their diagnosis 90% of the time, or they'll give you enough clues that you can make the diagnosis before you ever lay your hands on them. And I took that to heart as well. And I have found that to be much more useful than the previous piece of advice. But yeah, people, they live with themselves. They know what's going on. And if you're a good clinician and you can listen to your patient and elicit through well thought out questions their answers, they'll tell you the exact diagnosis 90% of the time before you ever get your stethoscope out.
So that was always one of my favorite phrases too. And then I found out somebody else beat us both to the punch. You ever hear of William Osler?
I have. I've got a couple of his books.
That's one of his most famous quotes. He was sitting in the oak-lined amphitheater for medical presentations at Hopkins, and he was a firebrand. He got angry listening to a junior doctor talking to a patient. He jumped up, slammed his hand on the desk, and said, "If you'll just listen to the patient, doctor, he'll tell you. He's telling you his diagnosis."
Yep. And I'll tell you this funny little anecdote, not funny at all, very sad. I was in a small clinic working part-time, and I heard a doctor tell a patient, "Ma'am, please be quiet. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with you."
Yeah, I think you had that in your book.
He was trying to auscultate, and she was trying to tell him what was wrong. And he said, "Please be quiet. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with you." And I just was like, wow, I don't know even what to say to that.
There's a couple of points on diet that I want to get to before we get too far away from them. One of them is carbs. The other one is protein.
Yeah.
It's my own confession. I got the one of those books from the low carb diet, the Scarsdale diet, and then looking at the one you're talking about. I got that, and I said, I'm going to try that. I didn't really read the book. I just started adding a lot of fats into my diet, but I didn't drop the carbs. I totally totally screwed it up. And then I started gaining weight. And then I decided, you know what? Maybe that's not the diet for me. But the problem was I never really read the book until later when I realized I myself had insulin resistance. Once I did, I slowed down. I started looking at it and I started realizing, no, it's not adding fats, it's dropping carbs.
Yep.
Something very simple, should have been very obvious, but you know what? I wasn't paying attention.
And
Yep.
you know, a lot of people might be surprised to hear you say that, but I'm constantly reminding people that doctors are just dudes and chicks. They're literally, they have every human failing that their patients have. We are susceptible to misinformation. We're susceptible to all the fallacies that I learned about in my logic class way back in undergrad. Where there's nothing special about us. We're not demigods. We make mistakes all the time. Having that stethoscope draped across your shoulders does not make you in any way omnipotent. Does not make you a demigod. And I think people need to hear that. And I think some doctors need to hear that. But I love that you admit that I just half-assed that. I didn't even really actually read it. I didn't even know what I was doing. And I think that's a very important message for patients to understand, but perhaps more importantly for doctors to hear as well. You're just a chick. There's nothing special about you. You just have a little extra medical training. You need to consider yourself a partner with your patient, not their boss.
To your point, well, you brought up yet another point, but to the point about docs not knowing what they were doing, this was at a time when I had already been to Hopkins, trained in preventive medicine there, did well, ended up running the preventive medicine program, training the other preventive medicine docs at Hopkins. And at that point in time, we were still all wrapped up into the low-fat diet.
Yes.
The big diet book at that time was the New American Diet. And what they did with that diet was they went all over the country and they were looking for foods that were popular because they tasted good and not taking the fat out of things that tasted good and trying to replace it. That was their whole thing. Yep. That was the state of the art at that point in time. Low fat, and take foods that people like that have fat in them and try to replace that fat with something else. Yep. Which, as you know, resulted in Entenmann's cookies and things like that, where they added a whole bunch of salt and carbs and created a whole lot of the problems we're dealing with today.
Yeah. And if you think about that dietary recommendation from the standpoint of animal biology, that's why it's immediately clear to me that's glaringly erroneous, because anytime you're eating a high carb diet, if you're trying to lose weight, that is going to require you to limit your portion sizes.
Yeah.
That by definition, that you will have to push away from the table before you're full. Now let's not think about us as this modern technological thing. Let's think about us as an ancient mammal. What farmer pushes the cows away before they've eaten enough until they're full? How would that even be practical? Well, you're going to have to lock them in a cage. That's the only way you can make an animal stop eating before they're comfortably stuffed. Think about that, right? There's no example in animal biology where an animal pushes away before they've finished eating. They eat until they're full. All mammals do that, without exception. All animals. There is no exception to that in the literature. Guess what? We're the same way. And so basically what the advice amounted to was, we need you to stop eating before you're full, and we need you to live in a state of semi-starvation for the rest of your life. That's what that advice amounts to. So then immediately, when people can't do that because people are mammals, they're never going to be able to do that. Now the terms gluttony come out, and sloth. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, you gave up, you quit, you are somehow
moral failing.
Yeah, it's a moral failing. No, it was not a moral failing. It was a failure to understand basic biological precepts on the part of the experts who were recommending that. You cannot make a mammal stop eating before they're full, unless the only way is to lock them in a cage. That's the only way that works. And you can't do that with people. There are laws against that. Therefore, everybody, almost everybody, by definition, will fail to adhere to a diet that one of its requirements is semi-starvation for the rest of your life.
Well, that's, I mean, what is it? 30, 40 years, 50, 60 years. Walter Longo, I can't remember the name of his mentor, but the guy that did the, what was that project? They basically built a terrarium out in Arizona and put him and a dozen graduate students in a plant-based terrarium for months.
Yep, I remember that.
Caloric restriction.
Sure. And I'm glad you brought that up, because let's talk about that, because there's, especially in the longevity research sphere or silo, caloric restriction, that is the mantra, right? And so again, you're telling a mammal, you've got to semi-starve yourself for the rest of your life if you want to live longer. Well, all the animals in the studies are locked in cages. But here's the thing, the missed takeaway message that I think is huge, that nobody ever talks about. How did they conduct these caloric restriction research studies? So the animal's locked in a cage, because if you let an animal out, they're going to go eat till they're full, right? That's how we're designed. So they had all these mice, monkeys, dogs. They've done it with multiple species. And they would give them 1/3 of their total food intake. But they gave it to them all at one time. They didn't come to them and say, here's a tiny breakfast, here's a tiny lunch, here's a tiny dinner, and here's tiny snacks in between. They gave them the full portion of food once a day. Now,
intermittent fasting.
Exactly. So are the benefits of caloric restriction, is it coming from the actual caloric restriction, or is it coming from the built-in intermittent fasting that the animals were forced against their will to do? Now you see, oh, wait a minute. And I've actually talked to David Sinclair at Harvard about this. I've talked to multiple different researchers in the longevity sphere, and I've asked them this question: how do you guys tease out what portion of the benefits are from caloric restriction and what portion of the benefits are from the intermittent fasting? Because they're basically doing a 23-hour fast, and then they're doing
one meal a day.
OMAD, yeah, and all of their answers are quite revealing, because you can see the sun rising. They're like, huh, I've never thought of that. It's like, yeah, you guys you can't hire enough research assistants to give them 3 meals a day with 3 snacks in between with caloric restriction. You're feeding them all at once. So all your results are muddy, because you don't know if it's from the caloric restriction or if it's from the OMAD. It's literally impossible to tease out where it's coming from. And I find that much of the benefits are from the 1 meal a day, the intermittent fast.
One of my favorite articles is a review article in the New England Journal. It was December 26, I think it was 2019. And it was about specifically that. I think it was Mattson and another guy. And they basically talked about that. They went through the caloric restriction thing, and then they said, if you go back and you look at it through these filters, the filter you just described, our position is that most of this benefit is coming from intermittent fasting, letting the body's metabolism go back into an autophagy type of state on a regular basis. Now, they went back and forth. I don't think it's too far away for me to remember, but it's still one of my favorite articles. If you haven't seen it, I'm sure you'd enjoy it, because it's dealing with the specific question that you asked David Sinclair and several other folks.
Yeah. And so my current assumption is, and it seems I get a huge signal from the patients I recommend this from. And you know as well as I do, doctors are constantly looking for signals. I recommended this. Oh man, a significant portion of my patients are getting better from that. Well, back when I was recommending the American Diabetes Association diet, I saw zero signal. I would have one person out of 150 who could stick to that and actually lose weight and lower their A1C. Never back to a normal A1C, but they could lower it from 7.9 down to 7.2. And I think that's part of the reason the ADA says, oh, if you can get their A1C from 6.5 to 7, that's a victory. That's a success. That's well managed. And I couldn't agree more completely with that than I do. And what I found is when you feed a human a diet that's high enough in protein and high enough in fats and low enough in carbohydrates, they're going to lose fat. They're going to lower their A1C and their insulin level back down to normal. And these diets are called fasting mimicking diets, whether it's keto, ketovore, or carnivore. If it's low enough in carbohydrates, you're going to get many of the benefits from the caloric restriction, aka intermittent fasting. You're going to get a ton of those benefits without having to suffer from constant hunger that comes with semi-starvation, from eating the 100-calorie SnackWell bar and then pretending like that's going to hold you for 2 to 4 hours until you can have another small meal. Nobody can do that long term. The percentage of people who can do that is it's on one hand. You could count that. It's very, very rare. But then when I started recommending, hey, let's eat a adequate protein, adequate fat, very low carbohydrate diet, the signal I got back was humongous from my patients. They would come in, they had absolutely lost weight. They had absolutely lowered their A1C and their insulin levels. They also started to report all these other things that I initially considered foolishness. Like, oh man, my knee arthritis is so much better. And they've lost 15 pounds. So I couldn't blame it on, they've lost all this weight and changed the biomechanics, right? My reflux is so much better. I had a guy who was scheduled for hip replacement surgery. He had called his orthopedist and canceled the surgery. He said, my hip doesn't hurt anymore. And initially I'm like, this is, the anecdote. It's the placebo. Yeah. Okay. But when you keep seeing this signal so strongly in so many patients, at some point I was like, maybe there's more to this. And I think you hit on it with the autophagy and the mitophagy from the intermittent fasting, because when you're eating a diet rich in protein and fat, you're more satiated for a longer period of time. And so these people would just effortlessly, almost unconsciously, they'd stop eating breakfast or they would stop eating dinner because they're so full they weren't hungry. So they could keep doing what they enjoyed without taking a break to eat. So they were increasing their fasting window unconsciously almost. It's like I wasn't hungry this morning, so I just skipped breakfast. Well, that's fasting. And that's going to increase your rate of autophagy and mitophagy, and probably increases your rate of lots of other great things that we haven't even discovered yet. But and then also they get to eat until they're comfortably stuffed. That's the other thing. They don't have to semi-starve themselves for the rest of their life. When they do break their fast and eat, they get to eat until they can't eat another bite and still enjoy all the benefits of these fasting mimicking diets and the effortless built-in fasting that goes along with that.
In prepping for this interview, this meeting, Ken, I found myself listening to you and Gabrielle Lyons. I think that might have been the video. I know one thing came out of that. I had never really questioned these, what the FDA recommendations for protein until I heard Dr. Lyons talk about, well, that may be okay for young athletic males and keeping in a nitrogen balance, but that's not optimization. And I've started binging on that, and I'm why don't you take a couple of minutes and summarize that whole topic?
So the current recommendations for what's considered adequate protein intake, she's absolutely right. It comes from animal studies that were looking at nitrogen balance in non-human mammals. Most of it was in cattle, because farmers are very interested in how much do I need to feed these cows so they're big and fat and tasty to go to market, right? And so they actually do meaningful nutrition research in veterinary circles, because it actually matters for the bottom line, right? Yeah. And so a lot of PhD, very popular nutrition experts and gurus on the internet talking about protein intake. They're just parrot-like repeating these recommendations, and they have no idea that there are no solid human studies validating that to this day. And it's like, what is and so then you start to question every influencer out there and every guru. But absolutely, the recommendations for protein that the average dietitian gives the average patient are greatly under what the amount of protein that person should be eating each day. And then you start to dig in. I'm sure you're digging into this as well. Protein quality, animal protein versus plant protein. And when you dig into that deep enough for long enough, you will be forced to come to the inevitable conclusion that for humans, animal protein's better. It's more bioavailable, it's more absorbable, it's more usable. It just is. And so, I'm sure I just made 10% of your audience upset with me. And that's fine. I understand that
and coworkers and family, social. Go ahead.
There's strong emotions.
But there really is.
Most of us, our grandmother taught us how to eat, or our mother, right? Nutrition, out of all the sciences, it is the one that is most closely mimics religious belief.
And I have to tell you, I don't push that very hard, but I taught epidemiology at Hopkins. I went way deep into this, and I can tell you, a lot of what we looked at was food epidemiology, and it is bad. You cannot. And with due respect to you, anybody that says they know exactly what we should be eating, I don't believe.
I totally agree. And that's why my proper human diet spectrum has the full range. I think that you can eat a carefully thought out vegetarian diet that includes eggs and seafood and cheese, and you can do fine on that. I think that on the opposite end of a proper human diet spectrum, you can eat nothing but fatty red meat and a few organs and do perfectly fine, be perfectly healthy. That's my range. And a lot of people, there are a lot of carnivores on social media who are zealots, and they will absolutely denigrate anybody who says you should eat any plants at all. Again, you're seeing that same religious fervor. That shouldn't even be part of a scientific discussion, but yet there it is on both sides. And I understand both sides. I understand their arguments. I've studied their arguments to the bottom of the literature, and there's no benefit from this emotion and from this rancor, but you see it in
anyway.
Nutrition discussion.
Yeah. And again, that's what I wanted to repeat it. I appreciate, given your position as a carnivore, there's a lot of very emotional carnivores out there. It's really nice to see a leader in the carnivore community say, hey guys, calm down, be nice. Just play fair.
There's no point. For me personally, my personal tweaking of my DNA, I do best, both from a lab work perspective and from just how I feel every day, what size my belt is. I do best when I eat as close to zero carb as possible.
Yeah.
That's what's best for me. But there are thousands of examples of people who eat 100 total grams of carbs a day in fruit and veg and stuff, and just have a little bit of eggs and meat and cheese, and they do fine. So to say that, oh, you've got to be a carnivore or you can go to hell, that's religiosity at its best, isn't it?
It is. And for folks that are watching, I don't expect many will not know this, but for those that are watching that don't, the reason Ken and I are both focused on carbs, and I'm not going to get into the carbohydrate insulin model and all that. I'm just going to say that the last National Health and Nutrition Examination survey indicated that starting at age 18, not age 60, not age 50, age 18, 1-8, over half of us have this disease, prediabetes and diabetes.
Yep.
And it is a disease where you cannot metabolize carbs, glycemic carbs. They cause you to rot your arteries,
Yep.
which in turn only damages the tissues that are supplied by arteries, which would include everything except maybe a little bit of your cartilage, your brain, your heart, your kidneys, your eyeballs, your erectile tissue, and other things that you might consider important. So that's why Ken and I both are focused on insulin, carbohydrates, eating.
Yeah.
Most people are eating more carbohydrates than they should.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time you have, Ken. I do want to get to, before we go, I do want to get to patients and getting access to you. I know that you have something up on your website where you see patients. What portion of your time are you able to do that?
Well, I have a very small private practice. That's not the majority of my day anymore, because I can do more good on social media. I can help more people that way. And I've structured it so that I probably have a patient panel of 200 people who've been with me for a decade or two. I've got a patient panel of elderly people who either can't get out of the house or who don't want to get out of the house, and I'll go see them at their house. And I see all my patients for free. I don't charge them anything because of the social media thing. And so I'm not taking new patients.
That's
and
interesting.
I probably never will have a full book of patients again, because as my wife Nisha pointed out, why would you waste your time taking care of 30 or 40 people a day when you could literally be helping 30 or 40,000 people a day? Words of wisdom, and every smart husband listens to a smart wife, right? And she's right. And you could say, well, financially she's right, but I'm talking about ethically and morally.
Oh yeah.
At what point do I hide this under my hat and say, well, I'm just going to help my 30 patients a day and everybody else can figure it out on their own? I don't feel like that's an ethical or moral decision. And I want to go back to you talking about the carbohydrates. What's got to happen, and there's a lot of docs that it's very hard for them to wrap their head around this, because what they're looking at, they're saying, okay, so you're saying with keto or carnivore, you heal these people's metabolism.
Yes.
And if that's true, Dr. Berry, then they should be able to go back to eating the carbs and not have the blood sugar spike. And I'm like, no, you're missing this. What I'm saying, and I think what Dr. Brewer's saying, is that we're eating too many carbohydrates to start with. I believe that through all of my study, that the human species is a low carbohydrate mammal by either design or by evolution, whichever way you want to look at it. If you feed any of us too many carbohydrates too often for too long, we will develop some degree of metabolic disease, whether that's hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, metabolic syndrome, or one of the many other chronic medical conditions that comes from being metabolically ill. You've got to change your paradigm. It's not that we're going to heal your metabolism, then you can go back to eating the jelly donuts and be fine. No, the jelly donuts were the wrong decision from day one, and they will always be the wrong decision. And I think the probably 70% of people, if they would just cut out all added sugar, cut out all the grains, and cut out all the vegetable seed oils, and then fill their diet with whole, real, one ingredient meat and veg, eggs, seafood, for 70% of the population, that would reverse their hyperinsulinemia, their prediabetes. That's it. Just those three simple steps. And if you look at it, those are the three things that have been in our diet for the least amount of time. Speaking on an anthropological timescale, grains for 8 to 12,000 years, depending on where your people came from. Sugars only since the 1400s. Before that, there wasn't zero added sugar in the diet. And then vegetable seed oils the last 100 years. Literally before that, nobody ate a drop of canola oil or soybean oil or peanut oil their entire life, ever. And so, again, people say, oh, appeal to nature. No, adaptation principle. Adaptation. We've been eating fatty red meat, Dr. Ford, for exactly the same number of millennia that we've been breathing air and drinking water and playing in the sunshine. We've been doing those 4 things for the longest period of human existence. And this is documented in the paleoanthropological literature. You can't even argue with it. And so I think that's the timeline. That's the measure for the adaptation concept. So any recommendation, my first question is, how long have humans been doing that? Have we proven that to be long-term optimal? Because that's what I'm looking for, is optimal health, not adequate, not limping by, not just getting by. I'm looking for, how am I going to feel my best, look my best, perform my best? You cannot ignore the adaptation concept, or you're going to give foolish advice.
Some good points. I tell you what, Ken, I've had a blast. I don't know about you. The question I would have is, do you have anything else that you'd like to cover?
Oh, we could go for hours, and I know you could too.
Agree.
We love this stuff, and we know this stuff is important. I can go longer if you want to, or we can do a round 2 in the future. But they're just so, once you start to apply these basic principles, like the adaptation principle, like is it caloric restriction, or is it intermittent fasting? Once you start to shift your paradigm, then other things start to fall into place for both patients and doctors. And for both patients and doctors, you start to go, well, if the American Diabetes Association is completely wrong about that, what else are they wrong about?
Well,
and then you start to think, well, what about the DASH diet from the American Heart Association? Well, there's actually a very well done study that shows that a ketogenic diet lowers blood pressure more than the DASH diet. Very well done study. And so then you're like, okay, well, what else are they wrong about? And then you start thinking about, well, what's their financial remuneration? What's their financial incentive? Ooh, that's a rabbit hole. I don't know if you want to go down that or not, right? And so it kind of makes you question everything, which in my opinion, that is the optimal healthy state of a human being. We have this huge brain for a reason. We shouldn't be mindlessly doing anything or mindlessly recommending anything. We should be thinking about everything, even things that seemingly are settled science. And so you can take that where you will, doctor.
So it's an interesting point about settled science and going where the money is. Go ahead if you've got a couple more minutes. I know you're passionate about that.
Yeah.
On a personal basis, I tend to not get too involved in political arguments. And it's one of the things that I questioned just again 2 weeks ago when I read your book. I have to admit, I think I should be pushing on my envelope in that space more. And I'm learning that from reading your stuff.
Well, it's uncomfortable, right? Yeah. If you had good parents, they taught you not to be intentionally confrontational in public.
Yeah,
that's just good manners. But you and I are faced with this special ethical problem that we took an oath, and we both meant that. We weren't kidding. We weren't joking. We weren't just saying that to check a box. We actually meant that, and we mean that even when nobody's looking. And so then, okay, with this ethical and moral compulsion to do the best for the most people that we both have, and learning what we continue to learn every day, because I don't think any of us have it figured out. I think you're exactly right. We're just a bunch of monkeys fumbling around in the dark trying to figure out what the hell is going on. With those two assumptions, then what do you do when you find something that when you apply it to a group of people, the positive signal from that is so strong it can't be ignored. But yet when you used to recommend the American Diabetes Association diet and say, yeah, go to their website, they got tons of recipes, just eat that way, and the signal you get back from that is either non-existent or negative. Well, what do you as someone who tries to be ethical and moral, what do you do with that? And so I wrestled with that for months, and I finally thought, because every time you go to the ADA website, the first thing that pops up is donate here.
Yeah.
Which I get, you got to have money to keep the lights on. But then also when I start to look at who donates the most, because I figured it was some, like Nashville, Tennessee, probably. No, it's Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. It's all the huge pharmaceutical companies that give them millions of dollars each and every year in donations. Right. And
Yep.
so then when you start to see that, man, if you feed humans a high carb diet, highly processed carbs, they get metabolically sick. Well, what are doctors going to do when a patient comes with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes or fatty liver or hypertension or metabolic syndrome or PCOS? Or I could just go on and on and on, right? Fatty liver, fatty pancreas, fatty tongue. All these are known things that are documented in the literature. What are you going to do for them? You're going to put them on a pharmaceutical.
Yep.
So most average people who know that 1 + 1 has got to be 2, whether you like that or not, they're going to immediately go, so you're telling me the American Diabetes Association is recommending a diet that's known to lead to increased rates of metabolic disease, and their largest donors are pharmaceutical companies who profit from lots of people having metabolic disease. That could be a coincidence, I guess. But at some point, you have to go. And so that's why I started calling out the American Diabetes Association on Twitter, saying, hey, how can you in good conscience recommend this recipe on your Diabetes Hub website that has 28 grams of carbohydrates? And then also, not only that, but then they'll say your serving size is one third of a tablespoon, ignoring all of human nature, right? And ignoring all of the science that shows very clearly that a high carb diet is going to lead to metabolic disease. But that's got the ADA stamp of approval. How do you reconcile that? At some point, I try not to be conspiratorial, but at some point, I think it's partly ignorance and partly avarice. I think that they're getting lots of money from the big pharma and they don't want to piss them off. I get that. I understand. But at the same, and they're like, well, okay, we'll change it so it's not quite so high carb. And that's their solution.
I try to be non-conspiratorial too overall, because I don't get into a debate that much, don't wear a tinfoil hat,
Right.
But it's crystal clear to me. And on the other side, it's like, who's kidding who? If somebody's in a situation where they make more money by having more people sick, then of course, and they've got the money to help push that agenda. You don't think they're going to push that agenda?
And it may not be that they're actively pushing it, doctor. It may just be that they're passively not addressing that,
encouraging it, or not
discouraging it. Yeah,
not discouraging it.
That's right. They're not actively discouraging it. They're passively kind of allowing it. That leads to the same result. Either way.
And there's no question in my mind, even though I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist, there's no question in my mind that groups like Big Pharma do contribute to disease production in ways exactly like that. I mean, anybody that would say that doesn't happen really has their head in the sand. It's
built into the way corporations run. You maximize profits. That's what you do.
Right.
And if you can do that by doing something that's looked upon as socially good, like starting a diabetes care
foundation,
group, a support group for them, and then recommending here's some recipes for you. Well, it looks like you're doing a public service, right? But in reality, what you're doing is you're maximizing your corporate profit. And there are multiple examples of that in many different medical corporate cultures that I'm happy to get into, some more egregious than the others. I think there are some spheres where it's actively going on. And I think in other spheres, and I think the ADA, that's what they are. It's just a passive avoidance. Let's not look over there. Let's just keep talking about, managing this with pharmaceuticals.
Well, I've certainly got time for one more egregious example, if you've got one.
Well, let's talk about dialysis.
Okay, go.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about DaVita.
I've heard of DaVita.
There's actually a great book written about this and just how egregious the overstep is. And if you go to DaVita's website, they link to the ADA food hub with all these high carb recipes. Well, people don't realize that dialysis there is one part of American medicine that is completely and 100% socialized and has been for decades, and that's dialysis.
Yeah.
Government pays 100%. They pay all of it. It is socialized medicine, and it's been that way for quite a while. And so basically, the DaVita and the other company, which is not nearly as big, they can just send a bill to the federal government and get a check. The end. That's it. And so the way that they treat their patients and the way that they recommend these high carb diets to people with early stages of renal disease, and I don't know if you've seen this signal, but I'll talk about reversing chronic kidney disease in a second. It's terrible, and there have been multiple whistleblowers who have come out of the DaVita culture. It's mortifying and horrifying at the way they treat dialysis patients. And the dialysis patients are captive. They've got nowhere else to go. If they piss off the DaVita clinic, what are they going to do?
So you're talking about DaVita clinic encouraging too much carb intake.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that in this case, I think they know at the corporate level that the more carbs you eat, the quicker your chronic kidney disease is going to progress. And ultimately that leads to dialysis, doesn't it? And then that leads to them making more profit. And so this is another place where I've seen a huge signal when I recommend either low carb, keto, ketovore, carnivore, whichever people like, yes, I can eat that and be happy and eat that for decades, then good, go do that. Their chronic kidney disease, stage 1, 2, 3A, 3B, even stage 4, I've seen it reverse 2 stages.
Yeah, I have
hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. I've seen stage 4 go back to 3A. I've seen stage 3B go to barely stage 2. I've seen stage 1 and 2 completely reverse back to normal kidney function hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times.
And the wisdom is you don't reverse kidney disease.
100%, right. If you ask anybody at DaVita, they're like, no, it's chronic and progressive. You never can reverse that. Well, no, not eating the recipes they recommend.
Right.
Yeah, sure. And so, I mean, I guess somebody could try to explain how that's just ignorance and not evil. I don't know how you could explain that.
I'm not going to try to defend that.
Yeah. So, that's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to not only educate people, but at some point I find myself protecting people from these associations and organizations and corporations. I literally have to protect people from these because their mandate is to maximize profit. That's what corporations do. You can't blame them for that.
That's the way our economy is built.
That's right. But if it's hurting people, then I, as a doctor, once again, with an ethical and moral obligation, I have to at some point speak out and say, no, do not listen to their dietary advice, please. It will harm you.
Really good point. Thank you so much. Hey, Jesus, we got anything else that we really, really got to cover today?
I don't think so.
Ken, thank you so much for your time. I've loved it.
It's been a pleasure, brother. I'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you.
So that.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are your thoughts? You ready to go into Q&A?
Let's go to Q&A, Gilbert. Are you ready?
Had a lot of questions, a lot of interest, and Ken's a fun guy. He's doing a lot of good on the internet too.
He's really good, and I was a little bit afraid of the show going like a little bit too long. I made a promise to keep the show below an hour, but we have a lot of questions to go through. So before we do,
Jesus, you have failed miserably at keeping it at an hour.
Well, I failed miserably on multiple occasions on multiple things. So that's
we
the
all?
issue right now. So I just need to do this 30 seconds real quick. Remember, PrepMed Summit, April the 18th to the 20th, Dallas, Texas. Early bird rates until April the 1st. Don't miss out. We have less than 10 spots available. So call 859-721-1414 or go to preventhealthevents.com. That's it. Now, you put it my graphic on there, Gilbert. I saw Dr. Burr really active on the chat, answering people who are non-YouTube members. It's like he's looking for people who are not members to answer questions. So
Just to give you a hard time, Jesus.
well, don't you do that all the time? So let me see. We have a better. Yeah, that's better. So a few comments. We have some hello comments from Richard Paul. Paul was in Las Vegas. We might go and revisit those videos from Dave Feldman's conference. That I'm pretty sure that was a really good event. So somebody was asking about, hey, can you ask Dr. Berry about ApoB? And I think Dr. Berry's opinion on ApoB is a little bit on one side of the spectrum, like the very opposite side from the spectrum compared to guidelines. We are a little bit more kind of in the middle. To say we're not saying that ApoB doesn't matter. We're just saying that you cannot base prevention on ApoB alone. And that's what a lot of lipidologists are doing, and just sweeping insulin resistance and other metabolic health markers under the rug and saying that it's only ApoB, and that's how you go into high dose statins. High dose statins are pretty much going to be effective on decreasing your ApoB. We're not saying ApoB doesn't matter. We're just saying, hey, don't neglect insulin resistance. Any comments on that, Dr. Brewer, before I go to the next one?
I was really hoping you'd ask. There was a whole lot of traffic on that, a whole lot of questions. Nancy Williams said we need another discussion on ApoB. My cardiologist is alarming me, threatening to dismiss me if I don't take a statin and bring down my high-risk numbers. Although I think what she's saying is a 0 calcium score and an A pattern on LDL. So, yeah, to the point about Ken's, he had Nick Norwitz on as well as we did, talking about lean mass hyperresponders. There was a lot of discussion and question about that further on down in the questions. And the bottom line is that there's been a lot of debate right now. The lipidology community and Peter Attia, another voice that many people are aware of on the internet, say ApoB causes this disease, cardiovascular disease. There's no question, no ambiguity. And the reality is, I think it's a can't see the forest for the trees issue, or maybe a tail wagging the dog is a better analogy. I've read Snyderman's articles that they've referred to. It's articles saying ApoB is so much better. And once you read the article, you realize what he's saying. He's saying ApoB is so much better than LDL. And here's why he's saying that. One of his most important points, I wouldn't argue with at all, and that is ApoB does include VLDL or remnant cholesterol. Well, that's one of the silly points of this whole debate. What is remnant cholesterol? What is VLDL? They're a metabolic marker. That's what we're talking about here. And even the lipidologists know that. Now, the issue, the real problem is this. Yes, I couldn't agree more with Snyderman and the lipidologists that ApoB is more important than LDL alone. But here's the point. Neither one of them is an adequate way to review metabolic disease. Metabolic disease is the dog. VLDL is just the tail. So you need to have OGTT, insulin response. You need to look at a full fractionation. You just need to look at a lot more stuff than a VLDL or ApoB.
Can agree more. So, just to the point that we were making, I know the title of the video was "Reverse Type 2 Diabetes Fast," and probably might have got lost between the lines. Uh, a lot of people, just like Kimberly, suggest doing an elimination diet, which is what carnivore and vegan diets are, or elimination diets that will have plenty of benefits, mainly on the short term and maybe on the long term. But both of them are focused on cutting carbs. And you can do a vegan diet on a low carb diet, and you can do a carnivore diet, which is by definition a low carb diet as well. And I think to kind of come to a common point of view on how to reverse diabetes fast, the very first thing that you need to do is cut all that processed and refined carbs. Dr. Berry mentioned whole grains. You do eat some oatmeal, some steel toed oats, and somebody put in the comment section, use the CGM and see what happens with your specific metabolism. And I couldn't agree more. A lot of people are on the diet tribalisms. A lot of people are on a vegan diet because of ethical reasons, which I mean it's fair. A lot of people are on a carnivore diet because for them it's easy just to cut everything, not to be too concerned about what to eat and just eat meat. And I think I agree more with Dr. Brewer on the side of like I eat a little bit of everything, just avoid processed foods, avoid whole grains, avoid all that stuff, vegetable oils, and you will get some results. And there's experimentation involved into finding what works for you. I just want to throw that out there because of the title of the video today. Uh, Check ADSR, lifelong learning is critical for success. Doctor doesn't end with med school or pharma sponsored conference or pharma rep visits. Yeah, that's the daily. That's on a daily basis. Doctors will get representatives from pharma industries promoting their products and giving freebies and travel to conferences. That's just happening every day. Um, and doctors are no different than other human beings. I have seen plenty of that stuff. Heck, I have been into conferences sponsored by big pharma. That doesn't mean that I just go ahead and prescribe all the medication they are saying. You should. That's just the reality. Like Tengu, any truth in the hack that you can reduce your glucose spike by 70% if you proceed your meal with a high fiber vegetable meal, supposedly to code slow down absorption of sugars. I'm very interested on knowing your opinion on this one, Dr. Burr.
I think it depends a whole lot on what kind of fiber you're talking about, what kind of sugar glucose load that you're talking about. You know, um, if you had like a bunch of broccoli or Brussels sprouts and followed that with some higher sugar beets, yeah, you could slow that down. We know, for example, that adding almond butter to oatmeal or especially steel cut oats is going to slow that spike down. So there is some validity to that, but I think what you need to do is experiment with yourself. Look at the foods that you're talking about, get a CGM, and then do an N of one study.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. An end of one study individually. That's the best you can do for yourself.
That's what our last video was about. It was the top 10 foods that people think are safe, but they're not. And it's because you hear, well, fruits are great. Well, we have people that they're diabetic and they do a banana, a pineapple, and 3 apples and a bunch of grapes and a smoothie for breakfast. And they can't understand why their diabetes is getting worse or why they're gaining weight. And it's like, come on. Well, anyhow.
Well, to your point about smoothies, and I'll see if we can fit this into some type of video. You know this. We saw a couple of articles promoting smoothies because of the effects on glycemia, and that has to do with both fiber and polyphenols on them.
Mm-hmm.
I was surprised myself. One apple did not raise my blood sugar at all. Boiled carrots did. And I haven't tried raw carrots just because of the braces,
Oh yeah,
But I
that would
mean,
be heck. That'd be hard.
that's part of the experimentation that you need to do on yourself. And that doesn't mean that I'm eating tons of apples every day, but I know that if I ate one apple, I'm fine.
It's one of the things that that I've seen. We haven't seen many of those since you've been on board with us, but I used to see it all the time where people would say, "Yep, if I eat lentils, it just rockets my blood sugar." And about half the folks that had the same problem would say, "No, lentils don't bother me at all." Lentils are one of those foods that's very, very individual in terms of its impact.
Unless you ask Dr. Gundry, he will have a different opinion on that one.
He would say, "What? They're all bad."
Oh
He's
yeah,
a plant paradox kind of guy.
yeah. Well, that's his
He,
book.
but he's actually saying that they all spike your glucose because that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, that's what I
Or
think.
he was talking about
And leaky
lectins.
gut and all that stuff.
Yeah,
We should cover.
lectins
We should
different
invite
issue.
him to the show
Yeah,
and
that's
see
an
his
idea.
opinion. Well, like NRA promotes firearms, apparently ADA promotes diabetes. Well, I'm gonna say that's an interesting analogy. I don't mess up with constitutional amendments and all that stuff.
I will
That's
say this:
not a good idea.
we got far fewer folks coming in and beating up on Ken with comments than I expected. You know, anytime you have a vegan or you have a carnivore, the other side of the fence is going to come in and throw rocks. And we had a couple of those, but just not that many.
Yeah, well, and if so, yeah, I saw that somebody said, "Well, why are you inviting people who are promoting carnivore diet?" We had one of the doctors who works with us. She's a vegan, and we had her on the show, and it was
She got beat
interesting
up.
to see the reaction. Yeah,
She got beat up pretty bad.
But I mean, we're trying to get people with different point of views. So we had Dr. Gil Carvalho, who is a little bit more of the guidelines and
he's
the
plant-based.
evidence, and he's plant based. So we're trying to get different points of views across. So I mean, I think it's important for people to understand what people are saying, what points are they're defending. Black Tengu, what should be the ideal ApoB levels? As far as I know, some people say less than 90. Some people
Yeah.
will say less than 80, depending on
80
your
to
cardiovascular
100.
risk.
Yeah.
Chris Linky, very high HDL and triglycerides ratio is above 5. What else can I do? I do resistance training 3 days a week, hit at least twice a week, walk all the time. That's a very interesting part, and I'm pretty sure Chris Link shared on this chat or down here that he's doing low carb for about 4 years. This is the time when you reassess. The time when you reassess, you see your CGM results, and then start looking at other factors that might be involved. Exercise, diet are of course the pillars of lifestyle, but then you have sleep issues, then you have stress management. Then you have supplements, depending on which supplements you're taking. Some might have different effects. That you go to your specific food intake and see the different perks on ones and others. And then comes to a point when if you're not doing that, you decrease your body fat. And if you have done all that stuff already, then you have to go back and think what's the impact of genetics and aging. And then that's when medications play a role as well. I can tell you, we had some experimentations, both Dr. Brewer and I, with fasting. I was really surprised on my triglycerides going up after the fasting, and that's just kind of the individuality that you will find on your own metabolism. Any other thoughts on what else can be done on this type of scenarios, Dr. Brewer?
I would take a hard look at BMI and body fat percentage because a lot of folks think that it's all about managing our carbs on a day-to-day basis. It's the hormones that our body, we think body fat is an inert energy storage tissue. It's not. It creates hormones that drive this process. One of them, I mean, many people have heard of leptin, adiponectin, maybe not adiponectin and some of the others. Very few people have heard of the hormone called resistin. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Here's what happens. The body fat cell starts to get full. It expands to about where it wants to go and doesn't want to go any further. So there's a mechanism within the body and the fat cell. What it does is it creates a thing called resistin. And resistance says, okay, shut off our ability to absorb sugar. In other words, make the insulin receptors resistant. In other words, create insulin resistance. And that is what body fat cells do when they get full. And so many people just don't understand that. So we focus on a day-to-day basis on exercise and making sure that we don't eat carbs. But meanwhile, we're feeding that fat monster that's in turn driving resistance, insulin resistance. So
Yeah.
that's something critical to think about, Chris.
Eating windows and overall calories at the end, they play a role. You can
They
go
matter.
carnivore, but you're eating 25,000 calories a day.
Yeah.
Well, or 2,500. I should correct.
There's that myth, and it's true. We don't burn nearly as efficiently if we don't have that mix of carbs and fats and proteins. You drop carbs or fats and you burn less efficiently. People think that, and that was the initial misperception about the Scarsdale or that ketogenic diet. If you get ketogenic, you're burning poorly and you can eat 2, 4, 5,000 calories a day and still lose weight. That's not true. It's really clear that there is some inefficiencies, but it's also been quantified. For the vast majority of us, it's 20%. So if you're somebody who has a basal metabolic rate, or what's the other term? You usually burn 2,000 calories, and you go keto, you can go up to, most people can go up to 2,000 plus 20%, so 2,400 calories. Even if you're eating nothing but fat and staying completely ketogenic, you start getting over that 2,400 calories, you're going to continue to lay down more fat. A very few, there is a subset that has up to 30%. So that would be a 2,600 calorie diet. But you can't eat 4,000 and 5,000 calories, stay keto, and expect to lose body fat.
Yeah. And most people on keto will lose some weight.
Yeah.
But remember, there are 3 things that you lose when you're losing weight. That's water at the beginning. You're going to lose body fat, but you can also lose some protein or muscle mass. So be careful about that. And I know you have been beating up on Mediterranean diet for years now, Dr. Brewer, but there is a clarification to be made. I know you kind of you have become kind of a Mediterranean diet hater. But there's one point to that. Mediterranean diet can be very, very heavy on grains and carbohydrates. That's the problem.
And that's why I'm a Mediterranean diet hater. You know, the true Mediterranean diet, like Jeannie said when she came on board, I spent some time in Greece, a couple of months one time. And when you get into rural Greece or Crete, it's not that extremely high carb, high grain diet. But the US version of it really is not so healthy.
Yep. And Mediterranean diet can have plenty of benefits. I was just nagging my wife that the last 3 days I haven't had anything green on the table. And I was like, we need some green on here. I mean, I'm not a vegan, not by any means. I eat my steak. But I was like, I do feel like I need some green, some fiber to it. And if you don't want to eat some green, you can just supplement your fiber. To the comment before that, there's evidence that fiber will decrease the absorption of glucose. Now, low carb diet, less than 100 grams a day. Yeah, there are different definitions. One is that, the other one is 130 or less, and the other one is, some say 25% of your calories up to 35% or less of your calories coming from carbs. So different definitions for low carb diet. Can you clarify how you gained 7 pounds during a 5-day fast, Dr. Brewer?
I was wondering if somebody was gonna call me on that. So here's what I did. A few weeks ago, we were thinking about doing a video on a 5-day fast, what happens in it. And I thought it'd be interesting to add some personal content. So I didn't get enough personal content in there, but And so we may do it again. It was a fun experiment. I actually lost 10 pounds. I didn't gain 7. But here's what happened. Over the next 2 weeks, I gained the 10 pounds back plus 3 more. So that's what happened. And I really wasn't that. My BMI is like high 22s. My waist size is 33, 32. So I'm not trying to lose a lot of weight. I was more interested in the impact on stem cells and autophagy and metabolism, those components of it. So actually, when I gained that 10 pounds back plus 3 more, I still didn't get, my waist size still didn't increase. I started getting more leg muscle. And I think a lot of that had to do with some changes I was making on my exercise routine too. I bought a sled and started pulling that thing around. And man, that was creating a lot of burn in my hips, thighs, calves. So I was getting some more leg muscle. The point that I had made was our channel manager has me going on a carnivore diet for an experiment. And I've lost 7 pounds already just after 4 or 5 days. And I didn't think that I was losing weight. I thought I was gaining it. So
Yep.
I got some weird stuff going on.
It is. That's part of the experimentation. Black Tengu, I won't give up fish, feta cheese, and bacon in tomato sauce with tons of olive oil. And one thing that it's important to remember, especially leafy green vegetables, they're very unlikely to raise your blood sugar because, as we said, that those are mostly fiber, so those don't get absorbed. And if tomato sauce is working for you, Black Tengu, and you're tracking with the CGM, that sounds really good. Thank you to Keith Lawson. If you're wondering why I'm answering some questions and I'm not answering others, just take a look at the icon next to the name of the person who is sending the comment. They are YouTube members, so this is kind of the perks. I appreciate that. PT and JB, looking forward to part 2. We might invite Dr. Canberry and have another discussion.
Yeah, that was fun.
Future. It was. It really was. Rick Folia, in part 2, please query Dr. Berry on insulin resistance. Yes. I know. This is insulin resistance. So I'm writing down this because should I go there?
Yeah, go ahead. I haven't really heard that, but go ahead, describe what you're talking about.
Well, I'm gonna say this, and this is not me trashing on Dr. Barry, of course. And when we invited him, we can just discuss on perspectives on insulin resistance. I think at the end, we might, just like would happen with other guests, we might think that we're gonna disagree, and at the end, we might agree. But if you know one of our friends, Daniel Trevor, he wrote a book called Unholy Trinity, which I believe is doing great. It's a really good book, and I don't know if I told this to Daniel. There are some chapters where I'm like, well, I probably not necessarily agree with all of that. But the main part, the main concepts, and the focus on insulin resistance and avoiding vegetable oils, I think that makes sense. It's a good presentation of Dr. Brewer's concepts. He was on Dr. Canberry's show, and he was describing, hey, Dr. Brewer does oral glucose tolerance test and insulin survey as the go-to test to identify if you're dealing with insulin resistance, which main cause of diabetes, main cause of heart disease and heart attacks and strokes. And Canberry was like, well, you might be able to get that information from a fasting insulin, A1C, and fasting glucose. And I think Dr. Brewer and I don't agree 100% on that specific point, because what you're describing with basing your assessment on insulin resistance on fasting glucose and fasting insulin, it's what is called the HOMA-IR test. The problem with the HOMA-IR test is that if it's positive, yes, you're definitely have insulin resistance. But if it's negative, you might still have insulin resistance. It's just that the HOMA-IR test is not picking that up, because you might have a fasting glucose and fasting insulin within range, really, really good, normal levels. And that is going to happen anytime you go on a low-carb diet. So do you want to translate, Dr. Brewer, or was it clear enough? For some reason, you're on mute. Let me help you. Oh, I
Thank
can
you.
help you. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So it's interesting. We we're working on a video right now that showed Jesus did a lot of work to show some of the actual lab tests. Obviously, the identifiers were removed, and hopefully, people will start getting the opportunity to actually see it. I've been wanting to do that forever, and Nathan, our channel manager, and Jesus put in huge amounts of work to actually show what we do. And again, hopefully, this will put some of that debate to rest. I see Jesus reacting there. I told Gilbert to put that no answer for you up there.
Well, if you're a Seinfeld fan, you know what that means. Uh, Joey T, does the flush from niacin indicate it's working well to lower cholesterol? Or if I don't get the flush, does that mean if it's not working well and it is not high enough to be effective? I don't think so. Do you, Dr. Brewer? I don't think the flush
No,
is the
I don't.
indication that it's working. It's just
I don't at all think that you have to have the flush in order to think that it's working.
yeah.
Mm-mm.
And you might have people who has the flush, which is remember, it's kind of a side effect, and don't get exactly the benefits. So that can happen as well. Chris Linky, if your triglycerides, I guess that's triglycerides, are too high, you're still eating too many carbs. Well, that's my point with what I was telling you about my fasting experience. I did kind of a 4-day fasting, water fasting, and then I added a 3-day sardine fasting. And after 7 days, I mean, I tested baseline triglycerides and 7 days after, and my triglycerides were actually went up.
From
I'm
what to
not,
what?
I think like 10 points. They were
Okay.
like 120, if I don't remember correctly, like 104, something like that, to something closer to 116.
You also got a little bit ill in the middle of all that, right?
Oh, yeah. Well,
So
no, the illness came after the fasting.
after that,
Yeah.
so I'm
So
curious
I'm
of what
curious.
yours are going to look like the next time you test them.
Well, usually my triglycerides are below 100,
Yeah.
and I tried a new lab, so I was wondering a little bit about that too. But I don't know. I mean, that sort of stuff can happen, and this is why one-time measurement might not be enough. It can give you a picture, and then you go over time and just recheck, retest, and see what's going on. I also think that I burned a lot of. I did MRI testing. I lost a lot of visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. So I'm wondering if that has something to do with that. Maybe moving some of that fat became that as triglycerides, not coming from carbs, but from fat that I was burning.
You were mobilizing that fat. It could be. I'd be very interested to see your next versions. Are you planning on getting one before Dallas?
Lab work?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. Maybe in a couple of months. And a fasting, well, I'll need to ask my wife about that first. She wasn't happy at all. All right, so we're gonna see this one, and then we're gonna close it up because we're almost at a 2-hour mark. Black Tengu, yes, I make my own salad dressing with tahini, lemon juice, and garlic, plus cold pressed extra virgin olive oil. I mean, sometimes you need to get to that level of detail and taking care of what you eat and what you do. Really, really good show, Dr. Brewer. Really good interview. Any closing remarks?
No, I tell you what, I enjoyed talking with Ken. One of the things that I enjoy the most is to see a leader in one of these two communities, one of these two warring communities, the vegans and the carnivores, saying, "Look, you know what? Let's quit beating up and criticizing each other. Let's just do our thing."
I remember a quote from Dr. Lustig when he was talking about the obesity models and saying that if you're subscribing only to one of the 4 models, and you can see the models on the YouTube live, go watch that video with Dr. Lustig so you can understand the models. You're right and you're wrong at the same time. And I think that's what's happening with both vegans and carnivores. You might be right and might be wrong at the same time. I believe carnivore will work. It's working fantastic for some people. I believe veganism is working fantastic for some people. I don't think those are solutions for everybody.
Yeah, I think we tend to forget about the what the doctors call supratentorial stuff, the stuff that's in our brain as humans. And our eating behavior is a whole big area there. And in many ways, it's more important than a lot of the other stuff that we're talking about. Because, like as we tell our patients, you and I can know our stuff very well, but it gets trumped by what a patient decides to eat for dinner.
That's right. Well, we might have a chance to talk about conspiracy theories in another moment and why Dr. Brewer likes some pharmaceutical companies and not others, stuff like that. Uh, but we don't have more time today, so thank you so much for watching the show. I'm pretty sure gonna try to put some shorts from this if you want to see kind of a less than a minute version. But we appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you guys for your interest.